President Trump has virtually addressed the 75th meeting of the UN General Assembly. The pre-recorded speech lasted nearly 8 minutes. The president spoke at length about the coronavirus, once again calling out China for allegedly covering it up.
As we pursue this bright future, we must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. In the earliest days of the virus, China locked down travel domestically while allowing flights to leave China and infect the world. China condemned my travel ban on their country, even as they canceled domestic flights and locked citizens in their homes.
Chinese leader Xi Jinping spoke shortly after President Trump. He did not respond to the president's criticisms directly, but said China would make coronavirus vaccines available as a global public good. As we've seen over the years, President Trump has embraced a different approach to foreign policy than his predecessors. Since he took office in 2017, the U.S. has retreated from several major international agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. Many critics argue the U.S. has become more isolated under the Trump administration. As part of her new book, Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order, Rebecca Lissner and her co-author argue it's not in America's national interest to continue closing the United States off to the world. In fact, she believes we should further embrace international cooperation as a foreign policy strategy. And Rebecca joins me now. She's a visiting instructor at Georgetown University. Welcome, Rebecca. Great to have you with us. So
Thank you.
You argue in your book that instead of turning inward and closing down and pulling out of alliances, treaties, and working relationships with other nations, the U.S. should turn outward. But you also say that the U.S. will never again have the sort of influence it had in a post-Cold War world. So how would you see this turning outward ideally manifest itself?
Well, thanks so much for having me for this really important conversation. And I think it's clear, as we saw at the UN General Assembly this morning, that COVID has revealed an international system that is on the brink of collapse. International institutions like the UN and the WHO are inadequate to the problems that we have. International cooperation is elusive, and great powers, especially the US and China, are increasingly at loggerheads with each other. But this damage actually predates COVID, and it's going to be with us even if Donald Trump leaves office next year. So for the U.S. and for the world to recover from the present crisis, Washington needs to embrace a new approach, one that rejects both Trump-style nationalism, but also nostalgia for a bygone era of American superiority, and instead embraces forward-looking American leadership in defense of an open world.
Interesting. And one of the things that you say is that we are not prepared for the threats that truly threaten us, that we spend too much time thinking about militaristic threats when the threats that are actually the most dangerous threats don't have anything to do with the military.
That's right. If you look to the future of international politics, it's clear that while military threats will remain important, much of international politics will be played out in non-military terms through economic competition, technological competition, political or ideological competition. And the problem is that the United States is utterly ill-equipped to engage in this kind of multidimensional geopolitics. We have systematically over-relied on our military as the leading instrument of American foreign policy, while under-resourcing the diplomats at our State Department. So if the U.S. is to effectively compete with China and is to build an international cooperative system that is equal to challenges like COVID, we need a new approach. We need a new approach that puts diplomacy and development at the forefront of American foreign policy and rebalances our national security toolkit away from the military.
So let's talk about some of your specific recommendations, specifically when it comes to China, because I guess that is one of the more thorny relationships the U.S. is struggling with right now. And as you know, China has dramatically increased its influence around the world over the last decade or so. What concrete steps do you believe the U.S. should be taking to both counter Beijing's efforts to sort of win global influence, but also, are we sort of locked into actually working with China?
So it is clear that China is the chief rival that the United States will face over the coming decades. It is the only country that both has a preference to close off parts of the world to American commercial and military access and the actual ability to do so. So the task for the United States is going to be to compete with China by right-sizing our military approach in the region, but also by leveraging allies and partners to build a coalition of forces that favor openness, that favor the new rules and laws and regimes for international politics that will govern emerging technologies, that will govern climate change, and that will govern trade in ways that suit American interests. But it's also the case that the United States will have to work with China on some issues. And there, we have to recognize that there are certain challenges that the United States simply cannot solve entirely on its own. And that means working with China on climate change. It means working with China on global health. It means working with China on issues like nuclear nonproliferation. And as we saw this morning, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that through institutions like the UN, but the U.S. has to keep trying.
So how would you recommend that happen? If we can't do it through the institutions that we've built, how would you recommend that we work with China while increasingly countering, as it seems to be moving more towards a hardline government stance, as we've seen in Hong Kong, and it's increasingly moving away sort of the Western humanitarian ideals we'd like to see it embrace? How would you suggest that we work with it, on these issues?
Well, it's a fine balance, and the U.S. needs to learn to live alongside a more powerful China that is not itself becoming more democratic. It needs to find ways to counter China's attempts to export its own authoritarian system and related preferences internationally, but it also needs to continue to engage in dialogue with China so that we can identify where mutual interests do exist and begin to cooperate in those directions. It's not going to be easy to insulate those cooperative efforts from a more rivalrous relationship in general, but it is quite simply the United States' only hope in addressing some of the largest borderless challenges that we do face.
All right. Well, Rebecca Lissner, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating work you're doing, and congratulations on your book.
Thanks so much for having me.